All right, and welcome to the final video section of the webinar training. So we're going to talk now about behavior management with the K-8 students. So using positive behavior reinforcement is really important. This is thinking about using encouraging statements instead of telling people what not to do. We will talk about this in a little bit in addition with restorative practices. So come see a staff member anytime there's an issue, and we'll call home if necessary. Again, this will be discussed in the next few slides as well. Important tips for behavior management: be consistent, which is challenging sometimes when you're an independent volunteer like this, but that's when connecting with the staff members is really important. So relying on them for support is great. Promoting resilience with the youth, which means there's certain things that the youth should come and get support for, and there's other things that maybe they should be resilient and deal with on their own. So that's something where, like, instead of maybe Amani comes and tells me that somebody stepped on his shoes, that's something that's so minuscule, and it was probably not on purpose, and even if it was, I think it's small enough that Amani can deal with it on his own. If it's a larger issue that has been something repeated, then that's something that we should address as a group. But we want the students to be able to deal with stuff on their own so that they're self-sufficient, because we're not going to be there all the time to resolve their conflicts. And so being gentle yet authoritative is an important piece of all of this behavior management, and not taking chances. If you're unsure about something, ask for support instead of gambling on whether or not it will work. Go and find support. So providing a space that is really safe is that's always our first goal, a safe space, which is literal and metaphorical in terms of physical safety, but also like emotional safety and feeling as though you are recognized. And so once they feel safe, they can have that connection, which is what we want to have with you as the mentor, so that the children are building relationships with you and with each other, so that they can build that connection. And then finally, once they have connection, that's when their skills can develop, so that they have English as a second language or even a third or fourth language. Their reading and writing skills are improving, their communication skills and their social emotional skills are developing better. That's what happens when we focus on the safety first. Then we try to provide them with healthy connection, and then connecting them to the skills. So some examples of positive language, it's fine to say good job, but you can also encourage more growth by using things like, yeah, like you did it, and look at you, whoa, you're like, that was incredible. Going beyond just regular old good job is important. And then like adding in like a play-by-play kind of goofing off, like, oh, and now Nabiombe is drawing a curved line around the left. What's it going to become? Oh, it's going to become a straight line now. Oh, and that straight line's becoming a corner. It's a 90-degree angle. Oh, so something like that. It's really goofy. You're probably laughing at me right now, but that's fine. I mean, we want you to have that goofiness, that you build the connection, and that allows the kids to then develop their skills. So let's talk about positive behavior reinforcement. So clear and specific instructions are really important. So with verbal naming, you want to praise the students who are doing the right thing, so we're not just focusing on the students that are doing things that are disruptive. You want to use proximity, so that you're standing close to the students who are being more disruptive, which is an effective way of managing their behavior without some sort of outright discussion of their behavior in front of the group. This is a way, and it also is a way to address their behavior without directly discussing it with that kid. So it's a really can be a valuable skill to just kind of stand close to them instead of actually pulling them out of the group. You also want to pay attention to ignoring. So sometimes it's valuable to ignore a behavior. Sometimes there's an attention-seeking behavior, which is somebody who's seeking connection, and so if that behavior, those minor infractions are disruptive, if you give them attention, that might reinforce the behavior. So ignoring that behavior in favor of praising students who are doing the right thing might hopefully encourage that behavior to turn into a healthier behavior. Using restorative questions to identify a trigger for a student if they're being disruptive is really important. So pulling them aside, if you've tried proximity and verbal naming, then you can then move on to restorative questions. So using restorative questions is something that's really valuable. So once you've used your other options like proximity and verbal naming, if that's not working well, then moving on to restorative questions is that next step. So that would be pulling a student aside and going through certain statements and questions, which actually there's a card that we can give you at the program. So just ask one of the program supervisors for that for that card, and then they'll give it to you. So just ask one of the program supervisors for that card, and they'll give you one. You also could suggest an alternate activity if the group activity or their homework is too difficult and triggering for the student. You want to use effective language as well. This is using I statements. This behavior is doing this to me, instead of telling a student what their behavior is or accusing them of something. And we'll give examples of this very soon. So let's talk about the final piece of positive behavior reinforcement, which is actually taking corrective steps. So if you've used your mentoring techniques, proximity and naming and restorative practices in order to address the problem, and it still has not been, still is not resolved. If you've tried using your mentoring techniques like restorative practices and proximity and verbal naming in order to address the problem, and that's still happening, you're still having that issue, then corrective steps is the final part of that. You would remind the student that if that behavior continues, then you'll need to go and talk to Mr. Obata. So that's kind of the final warning. And then finally, if it happens after that, then we do need to take action. So getting the help of one of the program supervisors is important for that. Of course, our only real consequence is to call home, but often this is effective enough because that means their parents are going to find out about their bad behavior. We also give the students many attempts to correct their behavior before even considering suspending them or expelling them from the program. So don't ever think that by telling us about a student's behavior issue, that means they're going to get kicked out of the program. That's not our goal. We think that's not a healthy way to resolve the issues. We want to include them in the resolution, but we need to do that together. And so that's how you can help us in this step, is by going to the program supervisors when you've exhausted your other mentoring options. So now let's talk about restorative practices. Restorative practices is based in restorative justice, which means repairing harm through building a relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. So this can happen in the judicial system, but also can happen in the schools and also, of course, in our after-school program. So there's a continuum of formal restorative practices to informal restorative practices. So we've already mentioned a couple of the informal restorative practices over here, which are effective statements and restorative questions. That's something that you can do. Effective statements is something that's really informal, where you can do it in the moment without having to really pull the student aside. These are things that are very valuable. You should just be doing at all times. Restorative questions moves a little bit further to the right than on the formality, because it is something where you would pull the kid aside to ask them these questions using that card that we had mentioned that you can get from one of the program directors. And then as you move further along, sometimes the program will do circles, even just proactively, to just address, how's your day? Did anybody help you today, as a group? But then circles can also be used to resolve conflicts. And of course, then that would move into restorative conferences, where it's a discussion between the victim and the perpetrator, using the restorative questions to repair the relationship and come to a resolution of some sort. So here's some effective statements from the informal side of things. So on the left side, you see the typical statements. So instead of saying, "Stop teasing Andrew," say, "It makes me upset when I hear you teasing Andrew." Or instead of saying, "Talking during class is inappropriate," you can say, "I'm frustrated that you aren't listening to me." If you say, "I don't want to see you fighting with AJ," instead you can say, "I was shocked to see you try to hurt AJ." So this is assigning values to the actions of the kids who are, maybe the perpetrator or just the student who's doing this. And so we want to assign those behaviors, because then that connects each of their actions to certain emotional results, whether external or internal. And so by doing that, we hope to maybe mold their behavior to improve in the future. So definitely look at these. These are really valuable statements, and I definitely find myself forgetting to use effective language and using more typical language. It's a constant improvement process that you're going to be working on throughout your time here with us. Here's another example, using an assertive voice instead of an aggressive or passive voice. Clear and objective directions. So it's time to put the blocks back in the bin. I will help you. Or aggressive. I'm not telling you again, you get over here now or else. Whereas passive is something where it's like, let's clean up these toys, okay? So it's like, if you want to, you can clean up these toys. We do want to give the assertive direction, but we also want to make sure that they don't feel as though it's a punishment or that there's some sort of threat. So here's some effective questions. So you might want to write down these questions and memorize, or just these questions are the ones that are on the cards as well for restorative practices. So, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? And these are questions you would be asking to the perpetrator. So the challenging behavior is something, somebody who's bullying maybe. You want to ask these questions on top, whereas the questions on the bottom is what you would ask the person who was harmed, so the victim in this situation. So we also try to think of behavior management through the social discipline window. So on the left side over here on the y-axis you have control, and then on the x-axis on the bottom you have support. So we want to give the students a high level of support and a high level of control, which means, yes, like our control of them, so making sure that they are disciplined and staying in the program guidelines, while also making sure that they don't feel overwhelmed by that control and that they feel supported and encouraged. So if you get too much control without enough support, then it feels punitive. If you give too much support without enough control, then it's more permissive. If you don't give enough of either, then it's neglectful. But by using a high amount of support in addition to a high amount of control, that is restorative. And so that's what we're trying to do with the program. So circles are very valuable for addressing conflicts between students. It's a way to proactively build community and also reactively resolve conflict. So here are the rules for circles. Again, this is something that we don't do every day, but we certainly try to do it when it's necessary, and just every once in a while to keep the kids thinking about these types of things. So one voice is really important, making sure that only one person is talking at a time, respecting the response, and all. So all of this stuff is important, and it's not uniform. It's not perfect. The students don't necessarily follow the rules, but trying to give them good reminders, like. We had agreed that we were going to have one voice, and it's frustrating that I'm hearing more than one voice. So again, that's using the effective statements and while being assertive, giving a high level of control while also supporting and encouraging better behavior.